rules. Money rules. Money.
Welcome to the Money Rules Podcast, where we tackle your personal financial matters with leading financial advisors. Your host, Boitumelo Ntsoko.
Many of us spend considerable time planning our investments and securing our financial future. But what happens to all that hard-earned wealth when we're no longer around? To help us navigate this complex terrain, we've invited Eric Jordan, who is a certified financial planner at Crew Invest, to shed some light on this matter. Welcome, Eric, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Let's dive right in. One common misconception is that a will dictates the distribution of all assets after death. However, that's not entirely accurate, is it?
That's correct. Certain assets or investment assets that you might have sometimes gets distributed outside of your will. Those are typically assets where a life insurer is involved, for example, an endowment or a life policy where you could nominate beneficiaries, or if you're invested within a retirement fund where the trustees of that retirement fund will allocate the benefit of your retirement fund to your beneficiaries. In those instances, those assets does not fall within the estate that the executor deals with, and therefore does not follow your directions in terms of your will, but rather your beneficiary nominations that you have indicated on those specific assets.
Could you walk us through what happens to different types of investments, starting with living annuities?
Yes, so a living annuity is one of those assets where you could actually appoint a beneficiary on the living annuity, which means that in the event of your death, the living annuity would then fall to your nominated beneficiary, and those beneficiaries will then have the choice whether they want to receive the benefit of that living annuity, either in the form of a further living annuity, or whether they want to receive that benefit as a lump sum. Both of those options obviously have different types of tax implications which needs to be taken into account when the beneficiary make that decision.
Now let's shift our focus to retirement funds. How are these assets handled upon the death of the fund member?
Yes, so in the case of a retirement fund, Section 37C of the Pension Funds Act actually dictates how those funds needs to be distributed in the event of your death. So in that instance, the trustees of the retirement fund has the obligation to look at who the nominated beneficiaries of the member has been, as well as who the dependents of that member was at the time of their death. They then need to make an allocation in terms of what an equitable allocation would be of the benefits of the retirement fund, and it therefore does not necessarily follow that the nominated beneficiaries of the member will receive the proceeds. It might be that either the allocation is different, or that a different individual in total might be receive the benefits if the trustees so decide.
Eric, moving on to endowments, what happens to these complex investment policies in the event of the policyholder's death?
Yes, so an endowment is one of those investments as well where you can appoint a beneficiary. If you did appoint a beneficiary, the benefits of that endowment would then flow through to your beneficiaries and will not pay into your deceased estate. Endowments could either have the benefit or the proceeds of the endowment can be paid out, so the monetary amount, or it could be a case where you become the beneficiary for ownership of that endowment, in which instance the endowment investment stays in place. You merely take the place of the deceased owner of that endowment and become the new owner of the endowment.
We know that tax-free investments like TFSAs provide tax benefits during an investor's lifetime. But what happens to these assets in the unfortunate event of their investor's passing?
Yes, so a tax-free savings investment needs to be determined based on the rules of that specific investment. So it could be a structure that you invested in that allows for the appointment of a beneficiary. If so, you should be making use of that nomination, and that will determine that tax-free savings account will pay out to your nominated beneficiary. However, if the product structure does not allow for nomination of beneficiaries, the tax-free savings investment will form part of your deceased estate and will then be dealt with by your executor and will be paid according to the wishes of your will.
Eric, unit trusts offer liquidity and diversification in investment portfolios. How are these assets handled in the context of estate planning?
Yes, so unit trusts are not an investment on which you can appoint a beneficiary. So in the event of your passing, in terms of estate planning, those assets will form part of the estate that the executor deals with, and you can then determine in your will either make a specific bequest of those unit trusts and leave those to a specific legatee or beneficiary, or it can form part of the liquidity needs within the estate. Alternatively, it will form part of the residue of the estate, and the heirs that receive the residue of the estate will then receive that benefit.
Offshore investments add another layer of complexity to estate planning, particularly concerning jurisdictional laws and taxation. Could you shed some light on how these assets are handled upon the investor's death?
Yes, so offshore assets or investments add another layer of complexity, and you need to understand exactly the structure, the country and the domicilium of that specific investor, of that investment, and what the rules are pertaining to that is. As an example, your will might not be acceptable in the jurisdiction within that offshore investment is housed, and therefore you might need to make either an alternative arrangement by drafting a specific offshore will for that investment, or it could be a situation where that offshore jurisdiction does not allow for freedom of testation like what we do in South Africa, and there might be certain forced rules of heirship for an investment. So it's very important to understand the rules, regulations, and so forth around the jurisdiction within which that investment is held.
Before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts or advice for our listeners regarding estate planning and their investments?
So, as you could hear, beneficiary nominations, specifically where that is available, is something that should be used because by bypassing the estate from an executor point of view, you can save the executorship fees on that. So it is actually quite an important tool to use where that is possible. Also have a good understanding of which of those investments will flow into the estate and make specific provisions for that within your will.
Wise words indeed. Thanks again, Eric, for joining us today and shedding light on this critical aspect of estate planning.
It's a pleasure.
That was Eric Jordan, who is a certified financial planner at Crew Invest.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Money Rules Podcast. To listen to more, go to moneyweb.co.za or the Moneyweb app and follow Moneyweb News for daily updates. Moneyweb, your trusted source for business and investment insights.